Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with baklava. That's right, at long last, I'm going to show you how I build my baklava. And as funny as it sounds, this recipe always reminds me of lasagna. Because much like that, most people use the same handful of ingredients. But as far as the ratios go, as well as the exact way they're layered, can really vary greatly depending on who's making it. So this is just how I do it. And if you have what you think is a much better way, feel free to keep that to yourself, because I like how this comes out. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And we'll begin with our nuts. And I like to use two kinds, some walnuts and pistachio. And while you can use one or the other, and many people do, I really do like the combination here. And then the only other thing we're going to add is a spoon of cinnamon, at which point we're going to process these by pulsing on and off until they're sort of but not too finely ground. And thanks to the power of video, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. So this right here is my preferred texture. And once those are done exactly how we want, we'll go ahead and set those aside. And we can move on to assembly. Assuming that is that we've made some phyllo dough, or at least bought some at the store and let it thaw. And by the way, I did make this the night before and left it in the fridge. And it seems to have held up beautifully. Those sheets separated easily. And they were still nice and supple and fairly stretchable. And one big tip here, whether you're using homemade or not, is to always keep these covered as you're working with them. Otherwise, they can get dried out and much tougher to work with. And for that, I like to use a barely damp towel. Okay, it's not so much damp than it is not dry. And then other than melting a stick of unsalted butter, we are pretty much ready to start assembly. So we'll go ahead and take that butter and brush it generously into the bottom of whatever pan we're using. And once that's been buttered, we'll go ahead and start building our bottom by layering up 5 or 6 sheets of phyllo. And if you happen to see little tears or uneven edges or small holes, do not worry. Okay, we're not machines. We are human. And things are going to happen. But the good news is when this is done, no one will ever know, ever. So please stack these layers with no fear. And generally the rule of thumb is we're going to butter every 2 sheets of phyllo. Although as you'll see later, I don't always follow that. And as you may notice, I'm not brushing, I'm dripping. Do not try to brush the butter on the phyllo. It is so thin, it's going to stick to it, and you're going to have a big mess. So what we'll do is drip over about a tablespoon at a time. And as this thing cooks, that butter is going to distribute evenly between the layers, even though we just dripped it and didn't brush it. So we'll go ahead and build up our bottom, as shown. And I think the minimum number of sheets at the bottom here should be at least 5 or 6. And yes, you can certainly do more. But my favorite part of the baklava is the nut mixture, not necessarily the pastry. Even though that's awesome also, I do try to get away with the least amount of phyllo I can, where it still comes out crispy and amazing. But anyway, once our bottom's been layered, we will go ahead and transfer in exactly 1/3 of our nut mixture, because we're going to be doing 3 layers of that, separated by just a couple sheets of phyllo. And while some people like to have a 3rd thick layer of phyllo in the center, like we do at the bottom and top, I prefer to place in just 2 sheets of phyllo, both buttered by the way, in between my nut mixture layers. And for me, those are there just to add a little bit of structure. And they're not really going to be noticeable in the final product. Okay, sort of like when we add a pinch of cayenne. You don't really notice its presence, but you may notice its absence. So we'll do 1/3 of our nuts with a couple buttered sheets of phyllo, and then another 1/3 of our nuts, followed by another couple sheets of buttered phyllo. And by the way, no, it's not your imagination. I did speed up the footage here to save a little bit of time on these repetitive steps. Otherwise, I would have had to fill up all the dead air with bad puns and vague references. And nobody wants that. But anyway, if everything's gone according to plan, we should be left with 1/3 of our nuts, which we can go ahead and dump over the top. And then to finish this off, we'll simply go ahead and repeat what we did on the bottom. We will layer up 5 or 6 sheets of phyllo, with butter being applied to at least every 2 sheets. And as I finish this off, I do apologize for the fast motion, which I really do not like to use. I find it annoying and off-putting. But I thought it was the lesser of 2 evils, since I didn't want to edit out any of the actual layering steps. So thank you for putting up with that. Oh, and I probably should mention, I'm using a round pan here, but literally any pan that's deep enough will work. Okay, you may have to adjust your amounts and the amount of phyllo you make and the size and shape of it, but the technique is not going to change. So you go ahead and make this in anything you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Frank Sinatra of your baklava. And if I can make it here in a round pan, you can make it anywhere in a different shaped pan. But anyway, we'll go ahead and finish off phylloing the top with, like I said, at least 5 or 6 layers. I believe I did 6. And ideally, once you've placed on that last piece of phyllo, you should have just enough butter left to generously coat the top. And I realized I said earlier to drip, not brush. But once this gets built up, towards the end when it gets kind of sturdy, you can actually do a little bit of brushing without causing much damage. So we'll go ahead and apply the last of our butter, at which point we need to cut this into portions before it goes in the oven. But not yet. Okay, we're not going to be able to effectively cut this until it's cold, and that butter hardens up and stiffens our sheets of phyllo. So what we'll do is cover this and pop it in the fridge for about an hour, at which point we're going to cut this into the beautiful traditional diamond pattern. And to do that, we'll make 3 or 4 cuts in one direction, and then turn the pan and make 3 or 4 cuts diagonally across the other way. And if you have a steady hand, which I don't, and you know what you're doing, which I don't, you will get perfectly shaped, absolutely even pieces. In other words, the opposite of what I get, which is every single piece a different size. So if you want to sketch a pattern on top to make these more even, go ahead. But I can't even pretend to be concerned with that. Because as you'll see, once this is cooked, it looks amazing no matter how you cut it. But either way, this has to be cut before it goes in the oven. Otherwise, it's virtually impossible to cut without wrecking the top. So once cold, we'll go ahead and cut that into pieces, at which point it's finally ready for the oven. So let's go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour or until beautifully browned. And what we'll do while that's cooking is complete our last component, the sugar and honey syrup. And for that, we're going to need a little bit of sugar, as well as 3 whole cloves. I'm also going to toss in a spoon of honey, which wasn't runny. It was kind of crystallized, but that's fine for this. And then last but not least, we will pour in some nice cold fresh water. And we'll go ahead and place that over medium-high heat. And we can go ahead and stir that together. And then all we need to do here is patiently wait for this to come to a boil, which is going to take a couple minutes. But don't walk away, because as soon as that starts to boil, what we'll do is give it a stir and turn off the heat, because we're done. That's it. Very simple. And you'll see as this stuff settles down, it should be relatively clear. And then what we'll do with the heat off is add the last 2 ingredients. One very familiar, a little touch of pure vanilla extract. And then one that's not familiar, orange blossom water. Oh yeah, so exotic. Which is going to add this gorgeous citrusy floral element, which doesn't sound great, but it is. And that's it. Once those 2 things are stirred in, it is ready to ladle over our hopefully now baked baklava. And there it is. Like I said, we're going to bake that for about an hour at 350 until it's beautifully browned. And just to help you visualize, the bottom's going to be 1 shade darker than the top. So I use that as my guide, and I try to get that just 1 shade past golden brown, knowing that the bottom will be beautifully browned. Okay, because we do not under any circumstances want a soggy bottom. So that is looking just about perfect. And what we'll do is let that sit for just 5 minutes before ladling over our syrup. And by the way, if you have a guest over, maybe it's date night, make sure they watch you do this step. Because there's no way to do this and not look cool and sexy. It's impossible. And to those people thinking, man, that's a lot of sugar syrup. It is, but it's about 25% less than most recipes call for. So I'm sort of doing a little bit of a diet version here. But anyway, we'll go ahead and apply that to our still hot baklava. And then by far the hardest step, we have to let this cool down to room temp before we eat it. All right, it's not good hot, nor is it good cold because the butter hardens. This, in my opinion, should be eaten exactly at room temp. And while you're waiting, you can just stare at it and pick out your piece. I think I'm going to go bottom right. Although not for the final plating and pictures. For that, I use one of my few perfect diamond-shaped ones. And to finish, I like to grate over a little bit of pistachio. Because I'm kind of fancy, and I think it looks good. And that's it. Once cooled down to room temp, and possibly pistachio dusted, our baklava is ready to enjoy. And I hate to think you've never had this before, but if you haven't, man, are you in for a mind-altering treat. Right, we got that crunchy, buttery phyllo on the bottom, and then our rich, fragrant, sticky nut layer, all topped with more buttery, crispy phyllo. And I was just about to say, as far as sweets go, this is one of the greatest bites of food in the world. But forget just sweets. This is just one of the greatest bites of food in the world. And now if you'll excuse me, I need to finish this, and also that oddly shaped one I picked out earlier. So whether you use the phyllo from the store, or you significantly raise your foodie street cred by making your own at home, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.